Welcome everybody. There's a couple more seats over here if you need a seat still. Feel free to sit right here in the front or wherever you like. Thank you for coming, everyone. We're going to have a talk tonight from Dr. Kaitlyn Creasy on loneliness. She is an expert on Nietzsche. She's a true expert on Nietzsche. That means basically that she's against nihilism. You know what nihilism means? She published a book on Nietzsche in 2020 that's been very well reviewed. Many people have talked about it. One of her colleagues called it depressive, for example. She has 2 more books under contract and a number of articles. She's editing 30 short manuscripts. 30 short manuscripts right now, so she does lots of really impressive academic stuff, but she's also has work that's relevant to living well. And that's what our talk tonight will be about, is how to live well. And if that wasn't enough, she also dreams in Italian. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaitlyn Creasy.
So it's been a while since I've dreamed in Italian, actually. But when I was at a higher level of fluency, I did. No longer, alas. Okay, I'm going to start today's talk off with a disclaimer. You might see the title, How to Be Lonely, and you might think that I am going to give you strategies for coping with loneliness. And that is not something that I'm going to be doing. I'm sorry. Strategies differ, and I don't have any. But what I have, what I'll be doing instead is trying to point out how loneliness can play in illuminating function, how it can show us things about ourselves, especially in cases where the thing that we are feeling lonely about or the reason for our loneliness isn't quite clear at the beginning. And I'll make the case that loneliness can also be generative. So it can be an engine for personal transformation because of certain features of what loneliness is. So again, like I don't have advice, this won't be a talk with much advice in it, but hopefully it will allow you to see what loneliness, which is an often awful experience, can show you the goods of loneliness, I'd say. Right, so that's my disclaimer. I then wanted to start with a story about how I got into loneliness research. So as Dr. Dicey Jennings pointed out, I mainly worked on Nietzsche before this loneliness stuff. And maybe there are some maybe there's like something that's continuous between those projects, but not an awful lot. I got into loneliness in a very distinctive way, right? Like my entry into loneliness was sort of like a personal thing. And to say a little bit more about this, about how my loneliness research started, I'll have to say something about how philosophical projects sometimes like get off the ground, or what philosophers sometimes do, at least my friends who are philosophers and other people I know. Not always, but here's what happens sometimes. Sometimes, someday, one day, you find yourself just gripped by a problem. Like something becomes apparent to you as a problem. There's some puzzle. And there's this puzzle that you feel like you need to solve. You have this sort of urge or impulse to solve it. So when you feel this grip, when you feel the force of this puzzle, the first thing that you often do, that one often does, is to look to the existing research or to look to other thinkers, often other philosophers, to see if other people have like a satisfying resolution to the puzzle, have like solved the problem. And if they have, then great, and then things make sense and so on, and you move past it. But sometimes when you look to other thinkers, you find that there isn't a satisfying solution, an adequate solution to the particular thing that's plaguing you, that you're gripped by, and then it's the work of philosophy, like that, then it's your work to sort it out. And in this case, with the loneliness stuff, the puzzle that I was gripped by was my own life and my own feelings. And to put it more precisely, like the puzzle was this. I had a loving partner and a son who I loved very much, who loved me, and a lot of several close friends, including since childhood, who are very loving and supportive and just all around wonderful. And I felt still really deeply lonely. And I thought to myself, this doesn't make sense. How? Why? Why? What can this possibly be? What's this about? And as can happen, like it was a bit opaque to me at first. It wasn't clear to me, right? That's why it was a puzzle, right? And so with that puzzle gripping me, I then turned to the philosophical literature, and turned in this case to a book by Kiran Satya, who's a professor at MIT, although this book is written for a more general audience, so not just for academic philosophers, because I found that he had this chapter in this book, Life is Hard, on loneliness. And I thought, okay, cool, that's a place to look. I looked at other places too, but this is the one that really stood out as like, right? So in that book, Satya says that loneliness is what happens when we don't have other people in our lives to recognize and affirm our unconditional worth as human beings and to reflect that worth back to us. And I read that and I thought, okay, sure. But the problem is that that's something I've got going on, right? And I still feel this thing. So let me talk a little bit more about Satya's account and then sort of move on to how to expand out how we should think about loneliness and possible reasons for loneliness, origins of loneliness, and so on. To dive a little bit more into Satya, he'll say, loneliness results when our worth as a human being is unappreciated, unengaged. And then here's a selection from the book. So he says, true friendship turns on the reciprocal recognition of human dignity. Friendship matters ultimately because the friend does, just like everyone else. One way to be lonely is to be separated from our friends and so to miss being with them. Apart, we cannot reassure them that they matter, and they cannot assure us. He then goes on to say another way to be lonely, which is more radical, is to have no friends at all. So you have no one reflecting back that your unconditional worth. So on this picture, the solution to loneliness is, easier said than done, of course, to make and spend time with friends who care about you, who love you for your own sake, and who value features of you, who care about features of you because they are features of you and they love you. So as long as you have loving and affirmative friends of this sort, okay, you should be good. This sort of cure-all. Of course, in my situation, that wasn't the solution, right? That wasn't a solution because I had friends who cared about me for my own sake, who loved me for my own sake. And I had friends, and I'm thinking here of friends in this broad category like Satya does, including romantic relationships and family members and so on. I had friends who loved my features and values as parts of me. Like, Katie, you speak so quickly, and I can't always, it's kind of manic, but it's part of you and I love it because it's part of you, right? So that's the sort of thing that's going on here. So I'm going to call in other examples now, and a lot of this talk will be working with examples to sort of test what seems to be missing or what seems to be the relevant thing causing loneliness. But I'll bring in other examples now, which are also, let's see, lightly fictionalized. This one's a lightly fictionalized version of my life, but we'll get farther away from that as we go. And this will help us see why Satya's account isn't adequate it can't account for all instances of loneliness. By the way, whether or not that's what he's intending, no big. This still helps us see where loneliness can come from, if not just that thing, right? Okay, so let's go through the example of Beatrice. Again, lightly fictionalized, very lightly. Beatrice has a small group of loving and supportive friends, all of whom she's known since childhood. While studying abroad in Italy in her second year of college, she appreciates an aesthetic, evaluative, and practical transformation, developing keen interest in philosophy and 13th century Italian poetry, and deciding to pursue a career in philosophy. At that point, she's dreaming in Italian. Upon her return, she also finds she has an increased need to engage intellectually. While her friends are fascinated by the changes she's undergone, they neither understand nor share her new interests, and they're also unable to engage with her intellectually in the way she desires. Sitting amidst her closest friends in her childhood home, as she has done hundreds of times before, Beatrice finds herself feeling lonely. What does she have? Loving and affirmative friends who love her for her own sake and who love features of her because they love her. Yet she's lonely. The Beatrice example, again, lightly fictionalized version of my own life, has to do with these interests in philosophy and Italian poetry and so on. But this sort of thing happens in many, many different walks of life. It's really all over the place. Like, as I say the example of Beatrice, you're probably already able to call examples of your own to mind. So for example, we can imagine a pediatric ICU nurse who goes on an especially meaningful work assignment and is changed somehow by that assignment. Maybe it was like especially psychologically taxing, then comes back and feels lonely, somehow disconnected, even if she has a loving partner, loving friends, and so on. We can imagine a farmer who moves to the city to take care of his aging parents and feels deeply lonely, even though his parents love him unconditionally and care about him in all of these different ways. This is the sort of thing, and as someone who is a first-generation grad student and an almost first-generation undergrad, this is something that really sticks out too. This is something experienced by first-generation students a lot of the time, right? So you might feel misunderstood or not fully understood by your family back home, but you also might feel misunderstood or not fully understood by the other students, non-first-generation students, for example, at your university. Then you feel lonely. And in both places, there's some loneliness. There are many other situations like this, and often they involve this kind of disconnect. Sometimes they involve this big transformation that you go through or something like that. But of course, it doesn't have to involve this big, dramatic personal transformation. We're changing all the time. So it's possible for this sort of thing to crop up. And we can hold steady this factor of loving people in your life who love you in the right kind of way. And it's plausible that you'll still feel lonely in certain circumstances. So what I want to do for most of the rest of the talk is walk through a number of varieties of loneliness having to do with lacks of recognition, lacks of affirmation, and lacks of connection. I'm lumping together the lacks of recognition and affirmation because they're a bit closer together, and then I'll go to loneliness resulting from certain forms of missing connection. It's a sort of broader category. One thing to say right off the bat is that when I'm talking about recognition, what I'm not talking about is admiration. So I'm not saying that someone who recognizes you admires you. When I talk about recognition and when I talk about particular recognition, what I'm talking about is feeling seen as the person that you understand yourself to be. Like feeling really seen, right, is the way that we'll talk about recognition here. Maybe. Okay, there we go. So let me get a big, broad definition of loneliness on the board so that we were working with something. So loneliness, very broadly characterized, is a painful subjective feeling that's going to result when our desires for recognition or connection are not fulfilled or are perceived by us to be unfulfilled. Of course, there are many different forms of connection that we might desire. There are many different forms of recognition and affirmation that we might desire too. I'll focus on just a few today, starting with particular recognition, or feeling recognized, seen as the particular individual that you are. There we go. Again, back to the Beatrice example. I'm not going to read it out loud this time. So plausibly, part of what is going on here, I think there are arguably multiple things going on here, but plausibly part of what's going on is that at this point in time, when Beatrice is returning home, she doesn't yet have anyone in her life with whom she's engaging with any kind of regularity, or maybe at all, who's able to see her as a person she understands herself to be, as a budding philosopher, where this is a central part of her self-conception or identity, as a lover of poetry, where this is, again, something central to her identity. And notice that often these lacks will be felt more intensely when the thing that we aren't being recognized for or seen as are really important to us, right? So these things that have become really important to her, there's no one in her life who can see her as that. And so she feels lonely. So this is a loneliness involving a lack of particular recognition. This is the first sort. Another form of loneliness is a loneliness resulting from a lack of what I'll call deep affirmation. So just as with the Beatrice example, I'm going to read this one straight through and then say a little bit about what's going on here. So Nina is a jazz pianist whose identities as a musician and appreciator of music are central to her self-conception. She is a talented, innovative improviser whose deep familiarity with the piano and conventions of the genre allow her to create moving and innovative jazz melodies spontaneously. An appreciator of music with a persistent love of instrumental jazz, she values music as an especially meaningful form of expression. Her friends are loving and supportive, appreciate very many of her qualities, and find her impressive. But none of them relate to music as she does. No one has the same passion for jazz. Although they are casual music listeners who enjoy other genres, they don't enjoy jazz and don't listen to it. So first off, it's possible that there's, again, this lack of particular recognition going on. It's possible, too, that there's a lack of deep affirmation going on, potentially in the other case. I think this highlights the deep affirmation a bit more. So what's going on here? Well, Nina has what I'll call an evaluative identity, right? She really values this thing, music, right? She really values jazz music, and that's central to her self-understanding, that value of hers. But as the example appears, there's no one in her life that values the value as she does. And so there's no one in her life to see that thing as worthwhile in the way that she can, and there's no one to value that part of her deeply valued identity in a way that might feel more satisfying. So if she were, for example, to make a friend with someone else who loved jazz music for its own sake, like a fellow lover of jazz, maybe a lover of instrumental jazz, what would the difference be there? Well, she would have someone who doesn't just value her, right, because friends value us. She would have someone who values her values and can see why they're worth pursuing, why they're worth orienting her life around, right, from the inside, right, in this deeper way. So surely, like, Nina's grandmother might also see it, judge it in some way as worth pursuing, but there's a sort of deeper understanding of the value of the thing that comes from valuing it yourself. And so the loneliness that Nina lacks, or plausibly lacks, one of the forms, is a loneliness resulting from a lack of deep affirmation. Another form of loneliness is loneliness that results when you lack recognition or affirmation of your aspirational self. Right? So you don't feel seen as the person that you want to become and affirmed as the potential that you have. Take the example of Leonard, a shy student with a talent for poetry, who has his first meaningful encounter with poetry in a required course in college. The instructor affirms Leonard's poetic talent, fostering him a desire to become a great poet. After the course ends, Leonard loses touch with his instructor. While he remains invested in this aspirational identity, he has no one to reflect its possibility back to him, no credible person to believe in this possible self of his. So in Leonard's case, there's this identity, right? Aspirational poet. There's this thing that he wants to be, right? A great poet, this aspirational identity, that no one in his life is able to reflect back to him as a possibility for him. And in cases where you have that and then it's lost, I think that these cases are ones in which this is like especially, the possibility for loneliness is especially salient or obvious. We can imagine that he felt less lonely, right? If he feels lonely at the end of this, we understand. And we can imagine that he felt less lonely when he had an instructor who said, hey, you could be a great poet, right? And felt affirmed for his poetic talent, even though it wasn't something that he really had yet, right? Of course, our aspirations are parts of us too. So there is a more maybe basic lack of particular recognition that might be going on, but there's this other thing as well. And I think this comes out really nicely in cases of romantic breakups. So when we fall in love with someone and when someone falls in love with us, we'll imagine a case of mutual love. We'll talk about non-mutual love shortly, but we'll stay on the good cases, the happy cases for now. When we fall until they get sad, right, okay, sorry, just sad cases today. So when we fall in love with someone and they fall in love with us, often what happens there is a kind of process of like idealization, mutual idealization, where this person sees you in a light that you didn't see yourself in. And it's often highly flattering, right? And you see them in this light too. And what can be so special about relationships like these is that you then feel sort of like called to that higher form of yourself that they see in you, right? It gives you something to aspire towards. Right, so maybe you take on, maybe someone thinks you're a better person than you are, like that you're better ethically or morally than you are. And you think like, okay, I want to be that, right? Then it becomes part of your aspirational self. But then imagine that that person was the only person in your life who saw that potential for you. And then you break up and they go away. In addition to being deeply disorienting, plausibly this will involve loneliness. And loneliness related to lack of recognition of this aspirational self. I have no one who sees me as this good person, as this possibly even better person any longer, right? Who affirms this potential for me. And so I'll feel lonely. It occurs to me right now, although I didn't think to bring this in, that this sometimes it can be kind of tricky with parents, right? Or caretakers who like have these ideas of us, these highly idealized ideas of us. And for better or worse, and sometimes for worse, we attach to that, right? And then they drop it, they stop believing in that, and we feel like, oh, right? That's a sort of disorienting thing. If we remain attached to that, even when they've dropped it, and no one else sees us in that way, again, it can be lonely making. So much for the varieties of loneliness related to recognition and affirmation. Let's move on to a couple of other varieties having to do with connection. And connection is just a much broader category than recognition and affirmation. So, okay, I take it that when we feel recognized, that's a form of connection. When we feel affirmed, that's a form of connection, right? Now we're just going to talk about important forms of connection that aren't able to be subsumed under these other categories of connection, of recognition and affirmation. Okay, so in addition to arising when we don't have our needs for recognition or affirmation met, loneliness can result when we fail to have other social needs met. And here I'm just thinking of social needs very, very broadly as needs that we require others to meet. So when we have certain needs and we need others to meet them and they don't, we'll suffer from a form of loneliness involving a lack of connection. I'll just talk about two of these. There are many more, but I'll just talk about a couple. So one form of loneliness that can result from a lack of connection is loneliness resulting from a lack of others to engage with you in your valued projects and activities. So arguably, this is also part of what was going on in that Beatrice, AKA Katie, example. She wanted to engage intellectually with others, and there weren't people that she was able to engage in that valued project with. If we flesh out the Nina case a little bit more, we can also see how this would arise in her situation, right? Maybe she wants, as a jazz musician and improviser, not just to improvise on her own, but to have the experience of improvising with someone else, right, on a different instrument. And it might come to matter to her quite a bit as a jazz musician that that sort of thing happens. And if it doesn't happen, she might feel lonely. I mean, like, among other things, right? But she might feel lonely. And sometimes this will involve things like pursuing certain fields or, I don't know, certain forms of art. But there are also more general projects that this form of loneliness can relate to. So we can imagine a single parent who wants to engage in the valued project of child rearing with another person who feels lonely because they can't for whatever reason. And again, in philosophy, in thought experiments, we're just imagining there's no one else, right? So imagine there's no one else to engage in the joint project of child rearing with. Imagine that's a sort of single parent situation that you're in. You can imagine that person perhaps becoming lonely because they have no one to share in this valued project with. And so on and so on and so on, right? So I have like a baseball player. Anything that requires other people to do the thing that you wish to do, but you don't have the other people around. The examples on top are about particular roles that we might take on, including social roles that we might take on, or particular projects that are specific to us as individuals, right? So Katie, the philosopher, Nina, the musician, Jack, the father. But there are also even more general, much more general valued projects that we all engage in as human beings, or that many of us engage in as human beings, that we need other people to facilitate for us, that we cannot do without other people. There are activities, choice-worthy activities, desirable activities, that we need other people to do with us in order to do it at all. So one activity that we might desire to do is to process our experiences with someone else, to process and metabolize and talk about our experiences with other people. This is why therapy can be so incredible sometimes. So if you feel like you haven't had anyone to talk to your experiences about, and then you get someone with whom you can talk about your experience, your inner life, your feelings, and so on, someone who you're like co-processing the thing that you're working with together, right? It can feel like deeply fulfilling. And absent that, you might feel deeply lonely. Again, this is like a basic one, right? Really general. It's what makes Friends so great, is that they play this role often, right? Another project is making moral progress or becoming a better person. So we might aspire to be a better person. That might be a valued project of ours, even if we're doing perfectly well already. But we need other people to do that. Not just because we need other people to say, yes, you're being good, but because often being a better person is about relating to different people in different ways, right? So if you were locked in a room and you wanted to make moral progress, you couldn't do it. It'd be hard if you couldn't do it. If you couldn't do it. I'm thinking of Iris Murdoch here, who's like, well, you could just like think about this stuff. But when there's a case where you cannot become a better person without other people, whatever that might look like for you, if your notion of moral progress is particular, then you'll feel lonely if you don't have other people with whom to pursue that project, who can actualize that project with you. Okay, and the last form of loneliness that we'll talk about today is loneliness that results when you fail to matter to others as you desire to matter. Notice that Setya's view of loneliness, where loneliness results from a failure of other people to reflect your unconditional worth back to you, that's like getting at something in this area, right? I don't matter as a person with dignity to someone, right? I might feel lonely. That's Satya's account. But here, what I want to talk about is when we want to matter in very particular ways, often to very particular others. And when we don't, we feel lonely. And this shows up in a number of areas in life, but here's just an example. Joy is a mother whose son, long reliant on her for affection and consolation, comes eventually to rely on a long-term romantic partner for these things instead. Rather than calling his mother about his bad day, he now calls his partner. Instead of seeking the comfort of his mother's arms when something goes wrong, he now seeks comfort from his partner. Joy and her son still share a loving, affirmative relationship, and she still feels assured of both her son's love and her continued value to him. But she can tell that she no longer matters to her son as she once did. She no longer occupies the same significance in his life. She wishes she still mattered to him as she used to. Again, we can imagine Joy being pretty lonely in this situation because she doesn't matter to her son in the very particular way that she wants to matter to him. She matters to him in a whole host of other ways, of course, but there are ways that she wants to matter that she doesn't, and she feels lonely. This comes out in many different areas of life, and I think an especially illuminating example is the following. So imagine that you have a close friend who you're deeply significant to, who you matter to a whole lot in a number of ways. Maybe you share values, maybe you give each other some form of deep affirmation, maybe they're able to recognize you, and so on and so on and so on. Imagine that all of those other things that I talked about, you and the friend, you guys can do it, right? You're engaging in joint projects, whatever. Now, imagine that you're in love with your friend and want a relationship with your friend, and that friend is not in love with you. Arguably, it would make very good sense if you were lonely as a result. You are failing to matter in just this one way, just this one particular way, and still, loneliness is a very reasonable response. We would understand it if you were lonely. We get that. Okay. So much for forms of loneliness. They'll come back when we talk about what loneliness has to show us, because we'll walk through how all these different forms of loneliness can show us different things. But before we get there, I want to point out a few things that all these different forms of loneliness share, that all these different forms of loneliness point us toward as the sort of things that they are. So loneliness, no matter the origin, no matter the variety, if we're paying attention to it, if we're reflective about it, and this is part of the pain of loneliness, I take it, part of why loneliness can be so disconcerting. Loneliness points us toward what I'll think of as what I'll call hard human truths, things about what it means to be a human being, that are part of being a human being that are tough sometimes. They're also beautiful, but we'll focus right now on the fact that they can feel tough sometimes. So what does loneliness do when we're attentive to it? Well, loneliness makes us keenly aware of the fact that we are needy, vulnerable social beings whose well-being and flourishing will often depend on other people. So we are powerless, just straightforwardly powerless in the face of certain of our needs, right? Think of the definition of social needs I gave you, they're needs that require someone else to meet. You're powerless to meet those needs on your own. We're dependent on other people. And we're vulnerable to other people, right? We're vulnerable to others' feelings about us, right? Think again about the example of the person in unrequited love with their close friend. These things are part of what it means to be human, but when we're made to attend to them, they can be disconcerting because looking at them forces us to look at the fact that we are not in control. We can't be fully in control. And when you're in pain and you're not in control, that's tough, right? These can be hard human truths. I won't say much more about this. I've said a little bit about this in a paper, but they're also features of human existence that make possible some of the most meaningful experiences that we can have as human beings, okay? So keep that in mind. But they're tough. And because they're tough, and because they can be disorienting, when we notice them and we're feeling lonely, we will often respond to these with attempts to exert more control, to like take the reins again in a situation where we feel like we don't have the reins. And when we do this too quickly, I'll argue we can miss out on what loneliness has to show us. So I'll just talk about a few of the ways that we might respond here. I should say right now that I'm not saying that these are bad ways to cope. These may be perfectly fine ways to cope. Sometimes they might be problematic, sometimes they might not be. But if we get to them too quickly, if we don't sit with our loneliness a bit, that's a problem, okay? So first, we might turn away from what I'm calling the deliverances of loneliness, right? These features of human existence that it shows us. We might turn away from that by insisting on our independence and self-sufficiency, by just like taking control of ourselves, trying to like master ourselves. So we might participate in practices aimed at detaching from certain outcomes and certain feelings. So this is in keeping with like pop stoic recommendations, like Ryan Holiday has recommendations that are in this vein. We can also try to actively secure the acknowledgement or connection we crave. Maybe we like go out and try to meet people, that's cool. Maybe we craft our image on social media to try to get certain forms of affirmation that like give us at least some hit of affirmation, but not the really deep kind of hit that we want, right? Again, the point isn't that these are always bad. It's that when we jump right to this, I mean, there are bad ways to do it probably, right? Like the social media one is like a little trickier. You're not gonna get the deep thing you want, right? But the point is that when we jump to this right away, when we don't sit with our loneliness, we don't benefit from what loneliness can show us. In addition, it's possible when we jump too quickly into these strategies that we will become alienated from important parts of ourselves, right? So loneliness can show us these important parts. When we jump right to this, we might become self-alienated. We're also prevented from facing up to fundamental parts of what it is to be a human being. Again, like this vulnerability stuff, this dependent stuff, like it doesn't go away. It's just a fact, it's part of what it is. And we need to learn to live with it. And we might miss out on loneliness's revelations. So the last part, how to be lonely. Again, I don't have advice. But what I do have is a couple of pointers. I have a few pointers that help you see what loneliness of different kinds can show to you. Things that it can help you know or see about yourself, ways that it can be transformative, and so on. Basically, if there's one piece of advice, it's that just like really pay attention to your loneliness. I think that there are cases where we think that our loneliness is pretty straightforward, like I have no friends. Or like I feel disconnected from my partner, and I'm lonely for this reason, right? But it's usually more complicated than that. That's the value of going through all these different varieties and forms of loneliness, because different things might be going on. So I'll say this much too, by the way. I didn't put this list together. Like I became lonely one day, and then the second day I was like, all right, here are the things I'm gonna learn from my loneliness. There are things that I learned along the way by trying to make sense of it, which meant that I had to sit with it, right? I had to really attend to it, I had to pay attention. Some of these things were factors, some of them weren't, right? But I wouldn't have known that if I just tried to run away from it, or look away from it, or whatever. Try to find other strategies that aren't really getting to the root of the thing, or at least trying to. So I guess this is a disclaimer of sorts, but loneliness can show us these things, especially when the reasons for our loneliness aren't clear to us at the beginning. But then I want to say, well, the reasons for our loneliness are often less clear than we first think. They're more granular, right? Things like this. Okay, So what can we learn from loneliness? Well, we can learn about ourselves. We can get some sort of like self-knowledge or self-understanding. So by reflecting on our loneliness and noticing that what I'm feeling when I'm feeling lonely is in part like, well, no one really sees me as a philosopher, or no one really understands, why poetry is so important, or sees me as this lover of poetry. Like, it's a really important part of me now. No one sees me as this or that. What that points us toward is our self-conception, our self-understanding, the things that we take ourselves to be. So by reflecting on this and noticing I don't feel seen as the person I am, and then thinking like, well, what is it? What don't I feel seen as? You can flesh out your self-conception a bit, your understanding of yourself and the parts of you that are central, that really matter. Reflecting on loneliness and noticing that you're missing a form of deep affirmation can attune you to your values and cares. This one was huge for me because I knew that I liked philosophy well enough by the time I was pretty lonely. I had tenure as a philosophy professor. It was pretty clear that I liked philosophy, right? What wasn't clear to me was that it was really important for me to have people in my life who valued it, who saw it as worthwhile, who really understood the value from the inside because they did the thing, right? That was important to me. And it wasn't something I realized until I found myself in this situation. So noticing that this deep affirmation is lacking, you can sort of attune to the things like, what is it that I want to be seen as worthwhile? Like, what part of my evaluative identity isn't valued sufficiently by the people I'm engaging with in my everyday life? Oh, this. Oh, that must be quite important. I'm lonely. Of course, in the case of loneliness relating to your aspirational self, where you don't have that aspirational self reflected back to you, you can get a sense of your valued goals and ideals, like who you want to become. So if you break up with your partner who thought you were capable of being a much better person in some domain or in some area of life, they go away, and you notice that you're feeling lonely, you feel disoriented. You can think like, well, that must matter to me, so I must find ways to do that. I should try to find ways to do that, right? Experiencing loneliness resulting from lack of collaborators and shared projects, especially valued projects and activities, can point you to the projects that really matter to you. Again, in my own case, it's the easiest case. So I always use my own case because it's the simplest one for me. I wanted to do philosophy with you. I wanted to talk about philosophy with people. And in my everyday life, I didn't have people that I could talk about philosophy with. There was a certain level I could talk about it with, or talk about it at, right? But there was something else I wanted to do. I didn't realize that I wanted to do that until I was lonely. And I realized that I wanted to do that in part, as badly as I did, that having like a person with whom I'm pursuing this joint project, or right, that I could do this activity with, like that became clear only once I reflected and thought like, oh, when I'm at conferences or when I'm in this place where I feel a little bit less lonely, what's that about? And so on. Oop. Well, it's like it's a sign. It's like, hey, you're talking for a while. Okay, I am talking for a while. Let's see. Okay. See, now I'm worried I clicked it twice. Let's see. I mean, probably at this point I can just vibe it, riff. Okay. In addition to showing you parts of yourself, loneliness can spur transformative change. So it can be an engine for personal transformation. One way to put this is that loneliness can be like an especially visceral and intense indication that you're settling for certain forms of life or certain relationships that aren't engaging you or fulfilling you in the ways that you'd like to be engaged or fulfilled. And in this way, loneliness can function as a call to action. So it can push you to make bids for relationships, maybe relationships with certain people. It can, in cases of loneliness of recognition, it can motivate you to try to articulate important parts of yourself to the people in your life. So maybe you can give them a chance to understand you, and vice versa, by the way, right? So it can be this sort of engine for personal transformation. And part of why loneliness is it can be so transformative is because it hurts, is because it's painful. When we're in loneliness, we want to get rid of it often, right? It has this aversive quality. So it can be this sort of negative engine to change things. But it's not always this, okay? Like loneliness can show us parts of ourselves. Maybe when we see these parts of ourselves, we realize there really is no one around right now who can do this thing. Loneliness can be personally transformative, but it isn't always, and it's not always an engine for like getting out into the world. In fact, people who suffer from long-term loneliness tend to become more withdrawn, to go out less, to engage less socially, rather than becoming more, right? So sometimes loneliness just will lead you to despair. And when that happens, it's really tough not to feel overcome by it. I have this slide because I just want to say that happens, and not because I have very good advice. I don't have much advice at all. But here's the one piece of advice I have, and then a short story to close out. Sometimes all you can do, truly all you can do, is to just keep going, however hopelessly, meaning like without hope of a positive outcome, just on faith. It's all we can do sometimes. It's just the situation we find ourselves in. And then sometimes when you're in this despairing loneliness and you've just kept going, and like sometimes something will come to mind, something will strike you, some strategy that you don't even realize is a strategy will emerge organically, will just kind of come out of nowhere. And that strategy might be an avenue for forms of recognition and connection that you didn't realize was there, that you hadn't seen before. For example, 2-ish years ago, I think, like this is where I was. I was feeling pretty despairing. And I was driving through the streets of Los Angeles, and I thought to myself, like, what do I do? What can I do? It's like, I think I just need to write this down. And that's when I sat down for the first time to write about loneliness. And since then, I've been talking to people about loneliness an awful lot because now I'm a specialist. And there are a few things more connecting between and among human beings than talking about loneliness. Who knew that would work? But it did. Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm.